I'm excited to welcome you to my channel. Before I dive into my story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Anastasia and I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. We needed a break, a chance to escape the constant hum of the city, the car horns, the crowded streets, the never-ending buzz of people going about their lives. So, when we finally managed to carve out a few days, we decided to head out to this little-known lake nestled deep in the woods. It was the kind of place where your cell phone barely got a signal and where the world seemed to pause, letting you breathe easy for a change. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the water. The lake was everything we'd hoped for, tranquil, with its glassy surface reflecting the surrounding pine trees like a mirror. You could see fish occasionally breaking the surface, sending ripples that spread out in perfect circles, and the air was filled with the soft hum of insects and the occasional call of a bird. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, like the calm before a storm. We were both in high spirits as we unloaded the car. The new inflatable bed was our little luxury, something we'd splurged on to make the camping experience a bit more comfortable. We had our fair share of sleepless nights on hard, lumpy ground, and this time we wanted something different, something better. I remember Anastasia grinning as she pulled it out of the box, her eyes sparkling with the excitement of trying something new. Setting up camp was a breeze. We found the perfect spot right by the water, where we could watch the sunset and listen to the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. The tent went up quickly, and soon enough, we had everything in place, chairs by the fire pit, the cooler stocked with food and drinks, and our brand new bed inflated and waiting inside the tent. It should have felt perfect. It almost did. But as we settled in, something felt off. It was subtle at first, a kind of tension in the air that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was just the quiet, the kind that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. Or maybe it was something else, something between Anastasia and me. We'd always had this way of balancing between playful banter and something a little darker, a little more unsettling. It was part of our dynamic, this push and pull that kept things interesting, kept us on our toes. But out here, in the stillness of the lake, that tension seemed to hover just a bit heavier, like a cloud that hadn't quite decided whether or not to rain. As the sun dipped lower and the sky turned shades of pink and orange, we sat by the water, watching the day fade into night. Anastasia leaned against me, her warmth comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beneath the surface of the lake, of our relationship, of this weekend. It was as if the lake itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And I couldn't help but wonder what that something might be. Once we had the tent pitched and the rest of our gear stowed away, it was time to set up the bed. We were both eager to try it out, imagining ourselves finally having a good night's sleep under the stars without the usual aches and pains that came with camping. Anastasia unrolled the inflatable mattress with a flourish, and I plugged in the pump, watching as the bed slowly came to life, expanding and filling the tent with the promise of comfort. At first, it seemed like our splurge had been worth it. The bed looked inviting, soft yet supportive, and plenty big enough for the two of us to stretch out. But as soon as we climbed on, it became clear that appearances can be deceiving. The moment I sat down, the bed shifted under my weight, sending a ripple across the surface that nearly knocked Anastasia off the other side. She giggled, trying to steady herself, but when she lay down, the whole thing rocked like a boat in rough seas. We tried adjusting our positions, lying on our backs, then our sides, then back again, but nothing worked. Every move one of us made sent the other bouncing like we were kids on a trampoline. At first, it was funny, there we were, two grown adults trying to find a comfortable spot on what felt like a bouncy house. We laughed, pushing and prodding each other as we struggled to stay still, the sound of our laughter echoing through the quiet night. But the novelty wore off quickly. What started as playful jostling turned into a battle of frustration. The bed just wouldn't stay put, no matter how much we tried to settle down. Every slight movement, every shift, sent us rolling into each other or teetering on the edge. The seams of the bed creaked and groaned under the pressure, adding to the sense that we were sleeping on something far less reliable than we'd hoped. Anastasia, usually the more patient one between us, let out an exasperated sigh as she rolled over for what felt like the 100th time. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, her earlier excitement now completely deflated, much like the bed felt beneath us. I couldn't help but agree. It was like the bed had a mind of its own, determined to keep us awake and uncomfortable. As the minutes dragged on, the laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy silence. We were both tired, worn out from the day's travel and the effort of setting up camp. But the thought of spending the whole night wrestling with this unruly mattress was daunting. The darkness outside deepened, the sounds of the forest growing louder as night fully set in. What was supposed to be a relaxing escape was quickly turning into a test of endurance. I glanced over at Anastasia, who was now lying still, staring up at the ceiling of the tent with a look of resigned frustration. The night ahead suddenly felt much longer than we had anticipated, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this bed was just the beginning of our troubles. Something about the way the bed refused to cooperate seemed almost symbolic, like a warning that the peace we were seeking this weekend was going to be a lot harder to find than we'd thought. By the time we finally gave up on trying to make the bed work, it was already late. The night had settled in around us, and the once lively crackle of the campfire had dwindled to a faint, flickering glow. The flames licked weakly at the remaining logs, casting long, wavering shadows across the campsite. We were both exhausted, our patience worn thin by the relentless battle with that stubborn mattress. It felt like the bed had defeated us, and now, all we wanted was some semblance of rest. We agreed to take turns keeping watch, though neither of us really said why. It was just one of those unspoken things. Maybe it was the unsettling silence of the woods, or the way the lake seemed so unnaturally still under the moonlight. Either way, there was a shared sense that we shouldn't let our guard down completely. I volunteered to take the first shift, letting Anastasia curl up on the bed to try and salvage some sleep, though we both knew it wouldn't come easily. As she lay down, I could see the fatigue in her eyes, but also that lingering frustration. She shifted around a few times, trying to find a spot that wasn't too lumpy or uneven, but eventually, she just sighed and settled in as best she could. I covered her with a blanket, hoping she could at least rest, even if sleep was elusive. I turned my attention back to the fire, poking at the embers to keep them alive a little longer. The warmth was comforting, but it didn't do much to ease the unease that had been creeping up on me ever since we arrived. The night was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made your ears strain for any sound, no matter how small. There were no crickets chirping, no rustle of leaves, just the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of a burning log. I found myself staring out at the lake, the water as smooth as glass, reflecting the pale light of the moon. It should have been calming, but instead, it made me feel like I was looking into a void, a dark, endless expanse where anything could be lurking just beneath the surface. The stillness was unnerving, the kind that made your skin prickle with the instinctual awareness that something wasn't right. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild in the dark. But the longer I sat there, the more it grew, a gnawing sense of unease that settled deep in my gut. It was as if the world around us was holding its breath, waiting for something, what, I couldn't say. But it was enough to keep me on edge, my senses heightened, every snap of a twig or shift of the wind making me tense. Every so often, I glanced back at the tent, where Anastasia was lying still. I could see her silhouette through the thin fabric, and the rise and fall of her breathing told me she hadn't fallen asleep yet either. I wondered if she felt it too, that creeping tension in the air, or if she was just too tired to care. Part of me wanted to wake her, to talk, to do anything to break the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. But I didn't. I just sat there, staring into the fire, listening to the nothingness that surrounded us. Time seemed to stretch on as I kept watch, the minutes feeling like hours. I poked at the fire again, feeding it a few more sticks, trying to keep it alive as long as possible. The flames flared up briefly, casting flickering light across the campsite, but even that small comfort felt fleeting. The darkness beyond the firelight felt heavier, more oppressive, as if it was slowly closing in, inch by inch. And through it all, that feeling persisted, like we weren't alone, like something was out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just nerves or exhaustion. The night was too quiet, too still, and it felt like the world around us was on the brink of revealing something I wasn't sure I wanted to see. It must have been around midnight when I noticed the fire had dwindled to little more than a smoldering pile of embers, the last of the flames flickering weakly before threatening to die out completely. The night had grown colder, the chill creeping in as the warmth of the fire faded. I cursed softly under my breath, annoyed with myself for not keeping a closer eye on it. The darkness was pressing in from all sides, and the thought of being left with nothing but the thin beam of my flashlight was enough to spur me into action. I moved quickly, trying not to disturb Anastasia as she slept, or at least tried to, on the wretched inflatable bed. Her breathing was soft and steady, a small comfort in the otherwise still night. I didn't want to wake her, she needed the rest, and I knew how frustrated she'd been earlier. So, I crept around the campsite, gathering what dry sticks and twigs I could find, my movements careful and deliberate to avoid making too much noise. When I returned to the fire, I knelt down and began arranging the sticks in a makeshift teepee over the glowing coals, hoping to coax the flames back to life. But the fire was stubborn, the wood damp and uncooperative. I blew gently on the embers, trying to ignite a spark, but each time the flame flared up, it quickly sputtered out, leaving me in near darkness once more. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, the warmth of the fire just out of reach. I kept at it, refusing to give up. There was something about the fire, about keeping it going, that felt important, like it was the only thing keeping the shadows at bay. My hands fumbled with the sticks, the chill making my fingers clumsy. After what felt like an eternity, a small flame finally flickered to life, fragile and weak but enough to hold onto. I fed it slowly, carefully adding more twigs until it began to grow, casting a dim orange glow over the campsite. Just as I was beginning to feel a sense of relief, I heard it, a splash, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the night. The sound was unmistakable, the kind of splash that comes when something solid hits the water with force. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my mind racing. For a moment, I thought it might have been a fish breaking the surface, but there was something off about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I turned my head slowly toward the lake, straining to see through the darkness, but the water was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. My eyes scanned the surface, looking for ripples or any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the lake, reflecting the pale moonlight like a sheet of black glass. Before I could process what I'd heard, another sound broke through the silence, the sharp, unmistakable click of my fishing rod jerking in its holder. I whipped my head around, my breath catching in my throat. The line was taut, straining under the weight of something big, something powerful that was pulling with all its might. The rod bent dangerously, the reel spinning wildly as the line zipped out into the dark water. For a split second, I was torn between the fire and the rod, my instincts warring with each other. The fire was still fragile, the flames only just beginning to catch, but the rod was on the verge of being pulled into the lake. Panic surged through me, my mind racing as I tried to decide what to do. The splash, the rod, the fire, it all seemed to be happening at once, too fast for me to keep up. In the end, instinct won out. I lunged for the rod, grabbing it just in time before it could be yanked out of its holder. The force of whatever was on the other end nearly pulled me off my feet, but I held on, my hands gripping the handle tightly as I braced myself against the strain. The fire flickered weakly behind me, a reminder of the task I'd just abandoned, but there was no time to think about that now. Something had taken the bait, something big, and it wasn't going to give up easily. The moment I gripped the rod, I knew this wasn't going to be an easy catch. Whatever was on the other end was powerful, pulling with a force that sent vibrations through the rod and up my arms. My knuckles turned white as I struggled to keep hold, the rod bending dangerously under the strain. It felt like I was fighting against a force of nature, not just some ordinary fish. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of adrenaline and panic surging through me. The fire flickered weakly at my back, and I knew I couldn't manage both on my own. "Anastasia!" I shouted, my voice cracking with urgency. "Wake up! I need your help!" There was a rustling sound from the tent as Anastasia stirred, her groggy movements barely audible over the tension-filled night. I couldn't afford to take my eyes off the line, but I could imagine her fumbling to shake off sleep, probably irritated that I was dragging her out of bed in the middle of the night. The line continued to whine, the reel spinning as whatever was out there in the dark water fought against me with relentless energy. Finally, she stumbled out of the tent, her hair a tangled mess, eyes half closed with the remnants of sleep. "What the hell, Matt?" she mumbled, clearly annoyed, but the sight of me struggling with the rod must have jolted her awake. Without another word, she grabbed the rod from me, her hand steadying the wild motion as she braced herself against the pull. With both hands now free, I turned back to the fire, which was on the verge of going out again. The flames flickered weakly, struggling to hold onto the small amount of fuel I'd managed to gather. I worked quickly, tossing more sticks onto the embers, trying to coax the flames back to life. The fire sputtered, reluctantly catching hold, and I blew gently on it, urging it to grow. The cold night air pressed in around us, making the warmth of the fire all the more crucial. Behind me, I could hear Anastasia grunting with the effort of reeling in whatever had taken the bait. The sound of the line straining under the pressure was almost alarming, like it was ready to snap at any moment. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw her standing firm, her body tensed as she fought against the unseen force pulling from the depths of the lake. "Damn, this thing's strong," she exclaimed, her annoyance now replaced by a mix of determination and surprise. The rod was bent nearly double, and I could see the line cutting through the water in a jagged path as the fish, or whatever it was, thrashed against being reeled in. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. We weren't that far from shore, and while the lake was known for its decent-sized fish, this kind of fight was unheard of, especially this close to land. I fed more twigs into the fire, watching as the flames slowly began to build, casting a warm, flickering light over the campsite. But even as I focused on keeping the fire alive, I couldn't shake the question gnawing at the back of my mind: what kind of fish could put up such a fight? The lake had its mysteries, sure, but this felt different, like we were dealing with something that didn't belong here, something we weren't prepared for. Anastasia's breathing grew heavier as she continued to battle the fish, her hands gripping the rod tightly as she reeled in inch by inch. The strain was clear in her face, the muscles in her arms taut with the effort. I knew she was strong, but this was pushing her to her limits. The line hissed as it cut through the water, the sound almost eerie in the stillness of the night. Finally, I managed to get the fire back to a steady burn, the flames crackling and dancing with renewed energy. I stood up, wiping my hands on my jeans, and turned to help Anastasia. But just as I took a step toward her, the rod gave a violent jerk, nearly pulling her off balance. She let out a startled gasp, but held on, her feet digging into the ground as she braced herself for the final struggle. "Matt, I don't know what this is, but it's huge," she called out, her voice tinged with both excitement and fear. I moved closer, ready to lend a hand, but the sight of the dark water, now churning with movement, sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just any ordinary fish. Whatever we had on the line was something else entirely, and for the first time that night, I felt a true pang of unease. With a few more well-placed logs and some patient coaxing, the fire finally roared back to life. The flames leapt high, crackling with renewed vigor, sending waves of warmth into the chilly night. I allowed myself a brief moment of satisfaction, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease as the light pushed back against the surrounding darkness. But that moment of relief was short-lived. Just as I turned back toward Anastasia, a sudden movement caught my eye. She was at the very edge of the lake, the rod still in her hands, her body straining as she fought against the force in the water. I could see the determination etched on her face, but in the next heartbeat, that determination turned to surprise. Her foot slipped on the slick, wet ground, and before I could even register what was happening, she lost her balance. "Anastasia!" I shouted, my voice cracking with alarm. It was like watching in slow motion. One moment she was standing there, struggling with the rod, and the next, she was tumbling forward, her arms flailing as she tried to catch herself. But it was too late. She hit the water with a splash that seemed to echo across the entire lake, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness of the night. My heart lurched in my chest as I watched the ripples spread out from where she'd fallen, the once calm surface of the lake now disturbed by her sudden plunge. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. The rod was now floating aimlessly, abandoned as it bobbed on the water, but there was no sign of Anastasia. The ripples from her fall spread wider, then began to fade, leaving the lake eerily still once again. Anastasia. I called out again, this time louder, my voice tinged with panic. I waited, every second feeling like an eternity, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound, no sign of her resurfacing. The dark water swallowed her whole, and the moonlight reflecting off the surface only made the scene more haunting. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts colliding all at once. Was she hurt? Caught on something below? Or worse, had whatever she was reeling in pulled her under? The seconds ticked by, each one feeding the growing panic in my chest. The fire crackled behind me, the only source of light and warmth, but it felt distant, irrelevant. All I could focus on was the still water, the emptiness where she should have been. I took a hesitant step toward the edge, my heart hammering in my ears, and then another, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Anastasia. I shouted again, louder this time, my voice cracking under the weight of fear. Nothing. No response, no splash, no movement. The silence was deafening, the kind that fills your head with every worst-case scenario you can imagine. My hands trembled, my mind racing with what I should do next. Jump in after her? Call for help? But we were alone out here, miles from the nearest town, with no one around to hear us. I took another step, my feet sinking into the soft mud at the lake's edge. The cold water lapped at my boots, and I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't just stand here waiting, hoping she would resurface on her own. The thought of losing her, of her being trapped beneath the water, spurred me into action. I dropped to my knees, my hands hitting the water as I prepared to dive in after her, when suddenly, a ripple. Then another. And then, like a ghost rising from the depths, Anastasia's head broke the surface. She was only a few feet away from the shore, her wet hair plastered to her face, water streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, the sight of her bringing a rush of relief so intense it nearly knocked me over. But that relief was quickly replaced by confusion and anger as she wiped the water from her eyes and started to laugh. Her laughter was soft at first, barely more than a chuckle, but it quickly grew louder, echoing across the lake. She waded toward the shore, still laughing, her eyes glinting with that familiar mischievous spark. My heart, which had just been ready to leap out of my chest with fear, now pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You should have seen your face," she managed to say between bouts of laughter, clearly enjoying the cruel joke she had just played. My legs gave way, and I sank back onto the damp ground, my heart still racing, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I wanted to be angry, to shout at her for scaring me half to death, but all I could do was stare at her in stunned silence as she climbed out of the water, dripping wet and grinning like she'd just won the lottery. It was just another one of our pranks, another cruel joke that teetered on the edge of going too far. But as I watched her standing there, still laughing, I couldn't help but wonder if this time, she really had crossed that line. A minute dragged by, then another, and still no sign of Anastasia. The seconds seemed to stretch on endlessly, each one pounding in my chest like a drumbeat of doom. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. The cold night air bit into my skin, but the fear gripping my heart made it feel like I was freezing from the inside out. I could barely breathe, the panic rising in my throat, choking me as I stared at the still, dark water where she'd gone under. I couldn't wait any longer. My body moved on instinct, driven by sheer terror. Without thinking, I dropped everything, the rod, the fire, everything, and plunged headfirst into the icy water. The shock of the cold hit me like a slap, but I barely noticed. All I could think about was finding her, pulling her out before it was too late. The lake was murky, the darkness of the night making it even harder to see. As I dove under, the water closed over my head, muffling the sounds of the world above and plunging me into an eerie silence. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the murkiness swallowing up any light that tried to penetrate the surface. My heart pounded in my ears, the only sound that broke through the stillness, as I swam frantically, my hands reaching out blindly in search of her. Anastasia. I tried to call out, but the water swallowed my voice, leaving me with nothing but the sound of my own panicked breathing. The cold water made my muscles ache, but I pushed on, refusing to give in to the exhaustion that was quickly setting in. My lungs burned, screaming for air, but I couldn't surface yet, not until I found her. The thought of her down here, trapped, alone, was unbearable. I kicked harder, my movements growing more frantic as the seconds ticked by, each one bringing with it a fresh wave of terror. But no matter how hard I searched, how desperately I reached out into the darkness, there was nothing. No Anastasia, no sign of her at all. The dark waters surrounded me, pressing in from all sides, cold and unforgiving. My mind raced, panic blinding me to everything except the fear that I was too late. Just as I was about to give in, to surface for the air my body so desperately needed, I felt it, something brushing against my leg. It was soft, barely more than a whisper of a touch, but it was enough to send a jolt of hope through me. I turned quickly, my arms reaching out to grab her, to pull her to safety. But there was nothing. My hands closed on empty water, the cold biting into my fingers as I searched desperately for something, anything to hold on to. The murkiness of the lake swirled around me, distorting my vision, making it impossible to see clearly. For a brief, horrifying moment, I thought I felt the water itself closing in on me, wrapping around me like a shroud. My lungs were on fire now, the need for air overwhelming. I had no choice. I kicked hard, forcing myself upward, my arms slicing through the water as I fought to reach the surface. The darkness seemed to drag at me, pulling me back down, but I pushed through it, my heart pounding in my ears, my chest aching with the effort. Finally, I broke through, gasping for air as my head burst above the water. I gulped in the night air, my lungs screaming with relief, but the panic didn't ease. I spun around, searching the surface of the lake for any sign of her, but it was as still and empty as before. The only movement was the gentle ripple of the water as it settled back into its eerie calm. Anastasia! I shouted, my voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. But there was no answer, only the quiet lapping of the water against the shore. My heart sank, a deep, bone-chilling dread settling over me. I couldn't understand it, she had to be here, somewhere, but no matter where I looked, the result was the same. Nothing but dark water and the haunting silence of the night. Gasping for air, my lungs burning and my heart pounding, I finally broke the surface of the water. My vision blurred by the cold and panic, I frantically scanned the shore, desperate to see any sign of Anastasia. And then, there she was. Standing on the shore, perfectly dry, her arms crossed casually over her chest, Anastasia was watching me with a wide grin on her face. Her laughter echoed across the lake, light and carefree, completely at odds with the panic that had been consuming me just moments before. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing, my brain struggling to reconcile the image of her, safe and sound, with the terror I had just felt. It took me another heartbeat to realize the truth. The sheer disbelief hit me like a ton of bricks, knocking the breath from my already aching lungs. She had played me. Again. The realization was like a punch to the gut. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by a surge of anger that made my hands tremble. My legs felt like lead as I trudged through the water, each step an effort as I made my way toward the shore. I was soaked to the bone, shivering uncontrollably from the cold, and my heart was still racing from the panic that had gripped me. But none of that mattered as much as the look on her face, the amusement, the triumph, the utter lack of concern for what she had just put me through. Anastasia, I croaked out, my voice hoarse and trembling with a mix of emotions I could barely contain. What the hell? She didn't answer right away, her laughter finally dying down to a series of breathless giggles. She watched me struggle out of the water, my clothes clinging to me, heavy and cold, and as I stumbled onto the shore, I saw the way her eyes sparkled with mischief. "You should have seen yourself," she said, barely able to get the words out between fits of laughter. "You were so panicked, I thought you were going to have a heart attack." I stood there, dripping wet, staring at her in disbelief. My chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. This was our thing, our twisted sense of humor, the pranks, the jokes that danced on the edge of cruelty. But this time it felt different. This time, it felt like she'd crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. I wanted to be relieved that she was okay, to join in on the laughter and let it all roll off my back like I usually did. But I couldn't. Something had shifted inside me, something I couldn't ignore. The sight of her standing there, completely dry and laughing, while I was soaked and shivering with the remnants of fear still clinging to me, made my stomach twist. "Anastasia," I began again, trying to keep my voice steady, but it came out strained, barely masking the hurt and anger simmering beneath the surface. "That wasn't funny." She stopped laughing, the grin slowly fading from her face as she realized I wasn't in on the joke this time. "Come on, it was just a prank," she said, her tone a mix of defensiveness and confusion. "We always do stuff like this." "Not like this," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I intended. You let me think you were gone." For a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension between us thickening like the mist that hung over the lake. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly shrugged it off, her usual bravado kicking in. "It was just a joke, Matt," she insisted, though there was less confidence in her voice now. "You know I wouldn't." "But you did," I cut her off, the anger finally breaking through. "You let me believe I lost you." "That's not just a joke, Anastasia." She opened her mouth to argue, but then closed it again, the words dying on her lips as she saw the look in my eyes. I wasn't playing along this time. This wasn't just another prank, another story to laugh about later. It was something else, something that left a cold, hollow feeling in my chest that had nothing to do with the icy water. I turned away from her, trying to get my emotions under control, but it was no use. The combination of relief and anger was too much, churning inside me until I didn't know what to do with it. I wanted to be angry, to yell at her, to make her understand just how far she'd pushed me. But at the same time, I wanted to wrap her in my arms and hold her tight, just to reassure myself that she was really there, safe and sound. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice small and uncertain, a stark contrast to the laughter from before. "I didn't mean to scare you that much." I didn't respond right away, my back still turned to her as I stared out at the dark, still water. Finally, I let out a long breath, the anger slowly ebbing away, leaving behind a weary resignation. "Just don't do it again," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "Please." She nodded, even though I couldn't see it, and I heard her take a step closer. "I won't," she promised, her tone sincere. "I swear." I didn't know if I believed her. But for now, I was too tired to argue, too tired to do anything but let the moment pass. As I stood there, still dripping wet and shivering, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed. And I wasn't sure if it was something we could come back from. We sat by the fire, its flames crackling softly as they licked at the logs, casting a warm glow that danced across the campsite. But despite the heat, I couldn't shake the cold that had settled deep in my bones, a chill that the fire couldn't touch. Anastasia was next to me, still giggling, wiping tears from her eyes as she replayed the prank in her mind, clearly amused by how it had all played out. Her laughter was light and carefree, the kind that usually brought a smile to my face. But tonight, I just couldn't find it in me to laugh along. I stared into the fire, watching the flames twist and flicker, but my thoughts were miles away. My hands, still trembling slightly from the adrenaline, were wrapped around a cup of coffee, but I hadn't taken a sip. The warmth seeped into my palms, but it did nothing to ease the tension coiled tight in my chest. The memory of that moment, when I thought she was gone, kept replaying in my mind, each time leaving me more shaken. Anastasia nudged me with her elbow, trying to get my attention. "Come on, Matt, you've got to admit, that was a good one," she said, her voice still laced with lingering laughter. "You should have seen your face." I forced a smile, but it felt hollow, like a mask I didn't want to wear. I glanced over at her, seeing the way her eyes sparkled with mischief, the way they always did after one of her pranks. But something was different this time. I wasn't just annoyed or frustrated, I was deeply unsettled. The fear I'd felt when I thought she was really gone, it was too real, too raw, and it left a mark that I couldn't just laugh away. "Yeah," I mumbled, looking back at the fire, my voice flat. "You really got me." But my words didn't carry the usual warmth or playfulness. Instead, they hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I could feel her eyes on me, the laughter slowly fading as she realized I wasn't in on the joke this time. The space between us, once filled with shared humor and lighthearted banter, now felt like a gulf, a chasm of unspoken emotions and unresolved tension. Anastasia shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the air. "It was just a prank," she said, her tone quieter now, almost defensive. "You know I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," I replied, still not meeting her gaze. But it felt different this time. She was silent for a moment, and I could feel her searching for the right words, trying to bridge the growing distance between us. "Different how?" she finally asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I sighed, running a hand through my damp hair. How could I explain it? How could I put into words the way that moment had cracked something open inside me, something I wasn't sure I wanted to face? The pranks had always been our thing, a way to keep things fun, to keep the spark alive. But now I was starting to wonder if they were masking something deeper, something we'd been avoiding for too long. "I don't know," I said, struggling to articulate the knot of emotions tangled inside me. It made me realize how easily things can go wrong. How quickly everything can change. Anastasia didn't say anything, and the silence stretched out between us, filled only by the soft crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the lake. I could tell she was trying to understand, trying to see things from my perspective, but it wasn't easy. Our relationship had always been built on this foundation of pranks and jokes, of pushing each other's buttons and seeing who could get the best reaction. But now, that foundation felt shaky, like it was hiding cracks we'd never bothered to repair. "I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice sincere. "I didn't mean to scare you that much." I nodded, appreciating the apology, but it didn't quite reach the core of what I was feeling. It wasn't just about the scare, it was about what it represented. I couldn't shake the feeling that these jokes, these constant pushes to the edge, were a sign of something more, something neither of us wanted to confront. We fell into a quiet, uneasy silence, the fire's warmth doing little to thaw the chill that had settled between us. I wanted to reach out to her, to reassure her that everything was okay, that we could just laugh this off like we always did. But I couldn't. Something had shifted inside me, something I wasn't sure I could ignore any longer. Maybe it was just a prank. Or maybe it was a wake-up call, a sign that we needed to stop hiding behind the jokes and start facing whatever it was that we'd been avoiding. As I sat there, staring into the fire, I started to wonder if this was the beginning of something we couldn't laugh away, something that would force us to confront the deeper issues lurking beneath the surface. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if we were ready for that. As the night wore on, the crackling of the fire became the only sound between us, filling the silence with an almost unbearable tension. The playful atmosphere that had once characterized our relationship had evaporated, replaced by a heaviness that neither of us could ignore. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the cold that had settled in my chest, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I could feel it building, that unspoken truth we had both been avoiding for months. We had used our jokes and pranks as a shield, a way to keep things light, to distract ourselves from the growing distance between us. But after what had happened tonight, there was no more hiding from it. The reality we had been pushing away was finally catching up to us, and I knew we couldn't dance around it any longer. The words were on the tip of my tongue, and I tried to swallow them back, to keep them buried where they'd been for so long. But the weight of the evening, the fear and anger that had simmered beneath the surface, finally broke through. The words slipped out before I could stop them, quiet but clear in the stillness of the night. "Maybe this isn't working." The moment the words left my mouth, the air between us seemed to freeze. Anastasia, who had been staring into the fire, still lost in the afterglow of her prank, suddenly went still. Her laughter died in her throat, and she turned to look at me, her expression shifting from amusement to something much more serious. Her eyes, usually so full of mischief and light, were now clouded with confusion and hurt. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tentative, as if she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat, the enormity of what I had just said settling over me like a heavy blanket. For months, we had been skating on thin ice, using our jokes to cover up the cracks that had been forming in our relationship. But tonight, the ice had finally broken, and there was no way to patch it up with a joke or a laugh. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I mean, maybe us, isn't working the way it used to," I said, my voice low and strained. "We keep pushing each other, crossing lines we never used to cross, and I'm starting to wonder if it's because we're avoiding something." Anastasia's brow furrowed as she processed my words. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows that made her look older, more worn. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. The silence between us grew heavier, the fire crackling and popping as if it were the only thing left alive in the darkness. "What are you saying, Matt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, the gravity of the situation sinking in. I didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to face the possibility that we might not come back from this. But I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. The pranks, the laughter, they were just band-aids over a wound that had been festering for too long. "I'm saying that maybe we've been using these jokes to avoid talking about what's really going on," I replied, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "We're not the same as we used to be, Anastasia. And I think deep down, we both know that." For once, neither of us had a joke ready. There was no clever retort, no sarcastic comment to lighten the mood. Just the raw, uncomfortable truth hanging in the air between us, impossible to ignore. Anastasia's face grew serious, her usual defenses crumbling as the reality of the situation hit her. She looked away, staring into the fire as if searching for answers in the flames. "I didn't mean to take it too far," she murmured, more to herself than to me. I didn't want to think about what it meant if we stopped laughing." "I know," I said softly, the anger that had been burning inside me finally cooling. "But we can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." The fire crackled between us, its warmth doing nothing to thaw the icy tension that had settled over the campsite. The night seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing in on all sides, making the firelight feel small and fragile. We were on the edge of something big, something that could either break us or bring us closer together, and for the first time, I didn't know which way it would go. Maybe we need to stop hiding behind the jokes," I said, the words coming out slowly, as if I were still figuring them out myself. "Maybe it's time we actually talk about what's going on between us." Anastasia didn't respond right away. She just sat there, her face illuminated by the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. I could see the struggle in her expression, the battle between wanting to keep things the way they were and knowing that we couldn't. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping as she let out a long breath. "Yeah," she said quietly. "Maybe you're right." The fire crackled again, the only sound in the heavy silence that followed. For the first time that night, we weren't hiding behind our usual banter. There was no more running from the truth, no more laughing off the things that really mattered. This time, there was nothing funny about what came next. This is where the story ends. Share your opinion in the comments. Did you like the story?